the wake of the Oliver's film, by the way, there was such a resurgence of interest in JFK that Congress actually was under public pressure and passed a JFK Records Act that created a 5-person civilian board with a mandate to declassify documents and records from the CIA, the FBI, the Secret Service, and so forth, which the Warren Commission had originally kept secret for 75 years. And the choice of that time span, Howard, is no coincidence. The average lifespan of an American citizen is around 75 years. So their plan was to ensure that when these documents and records would eventually be released, that no one had been alive at the time could contest them. Yeah.
Too late.
Yeah. It was
All right. So we know that JFK had enemies. History shows us that. Of course he had them. The Cubans, for one. Fidel Castro didn't like him because of the Bay of Pigs, etc. The mob certainly didn't like him because of what he and his brother were doing to them. You know, the Secret Service didn't have a lot of time for him, so lots of potential smoking guns there. But that's
the more important. And I'm going to return to your question, by the way, because I gave a presentation at Cambridge, as I recall, it was actually in 2008, on the very topic of the magic bullet. So that, you know, what happened is this, Howard. The day of the assassination, the official account was that there had been 3 shots. This was broadcast immediately, even though there had been no investigation. Dealey Plaza has lots of echoes. It would have been, extremely difficult to know how many shots had or had not been fired, particularly when all the weapons, with possibly the exception of the one fired from the Deltex, appear to have been silenced. And that weapon, by the way, appears to have been a Mannlicher Carcano, which is not a very accurate or reliable weapon, where 3 shots seem to have been fired from the location, one of which, as I mentioned, hit Jack in the head, but the 2 others missed. One hit a curbing and injured a distant bystander by the name of James Tague, who actually had blood from his cheek from a chip from the concrete. And the other missed and hit the chrome strip above the limousine windshield. So that when the Secret Service and the FBI concluded the day of the assassination that there had been 3 shots with 3 hits, that Jack had been hit in the back, 5.5 inches below the collar to the right of the spinal column, as I described, that Conley had been hit in the back, a bullet that passed through his chest, broke a rib, exited his chest, hit his right wrist, and wound up in his left thigh. And the third hitting Jack in the back of the head and killing him. Now, there was a shot that hit Jack in the back of the head. And, of course, there was a wound to Conley. But when it turned out that this one shot had missed and the bystander, James Tague, had actually suffered an injury from it, the Warren Commission was thrown into a quandary. They'd already done a reconstruction. They'd had stand-ins for JFK with a large patch on his back where the bullet had actually hit him in the back. They had a smaller patch in the back of the head where a bullet had hit him in the back of the head. But they had, Conley was a whole separate matter. So now what they had to do was some fancy footwork, which fell largely to be the responsibility of Arlen Specter, who was then a junior counsel, to fabricate this theory that the bullet that hit him in the back, which was well established and for which we have multiple indications, as I explained in the study I presented at Cambridge, which you can access under the title Reasoning About Assassinations. They had to do some fancy footwork and re-describe the wound to the back as though it had hit at the base of the back of the neck, traversed his neck without hitting any bony structure, exited his throat. You see, so now you got a throat wound that was an entry, which you're now going to explain away as an exit, and go into Conley's back. So by making subtle shifts in where they were located relative to one another, by doing a reconstruction using the Secret Service Cadillac instead of the Lincoln limousine, which of course meant it had no forensic significance whatsoever, they fabricated this phony theory where we now know that, in fact, Gerald Ford, who was then a Republican representative from Michigan and a member of the commission, had the description of the wound changed from his uppermost back, which was already an exaggeration, to the base of the back of the neck. But we have all kinds of evidence that refutes it that I present in Reasoning About Assassination, including diagrams, autopsy diagrams, and a diagram by FBI agents who were there, the death certificate by Admiral George Berkeley, who was the president's personal physician, who described the second wound as at the level of the third thoracic vertebrae, which just happens to correspond to 5.5 inches below the collar and to the right of the spinal column. We have the reenactment photographs. I mean, the evidence here is really quite massive. have and doesn't.
Okay, so we have to cut to the chase with this one. This proved to you, you thought, that dark forces could be at work in your country, and this, by the sounds of it, was a bit of a revelation back then to you, as it is probably still to an awful lot of people. So when you believe that governments can do that kind of thing and dark forces can conspire to do that kind of thing, don't you then start trying to find conspiracy theories in everything?
Well, I'm not going out and looking for them, Howard. I mean, it's sort of a drop in my lap. I mean, look, I was working with the best qualified individuals to ever study the assassination. I put together a research group, including a world authority on the human brain, who was also an expert in wound ballistics, a PhD in physics, who was also board certified in radiation oncology, who would discover almost immediately when he entered the National Archives with the permission of the Kennedy family that the autopsy x-rays had been altered to conceal that blowout to the back of the head. And to add a 6
Understood. I mean, the quality of research sounds amazing, and I want to talk to you nearer the time of that anniversary about this, because that's a whole other mine of information.
But you're
I think
absolutely correct. When I began to see signs that something was wrong about 9/11, I knew, based upon my previous research on JFK, where I published 3 collections of studies by experts on the case, assassination, science, murder in Dealey Plaza, the great Zapruder film hoax, and had given, hundreds of interviews, even produced a 4.5-hour documentary of my own, shared or co-chaired 4 national conferences. I knew the government does this. I knew the tricks of the trade.
What I'm trying to say is that having a background in this, you wake up
Exactly.
to the terrible day that 9/11 happens, and you're conditioned to think, my God, there goes another one.
Well, no, I'm not conditioned. It's just that if I look at the evidence, I know how to read the signs. It's like people who are students of tree rings or geological strata. You have to have an expert background to understand what they mean. And because of my background in the techniques of subterfuge, of deception and deceit, including phony photographs such as the backyard photographs, which were fake, the planting weapon that couldn't even have fired the bullets that killed the president, on and on and on, where you can find a nice summary overview in Dealey Plaza Revisited, What Happened at JFK, which has been published as Chapter 30 of a book from a national conference at the University of North Carolina where Theodore Sorensen was the keynote speaker, and where John Thunheim, who would become the head of the 5-person civilian panel, the Assassination Records Review Board, that declassified 60,000 documents and record, introduced me at that meeting. You can find a summary overview that puts the evidence together. I don't go out looking for these things, Howard, but if they are happening before my eyes, because I know how these things are done, it is relatively effortless, and I say that compared to the average citizen, for me to discern the signs that we are being deceived.
Okay. So 9/11 happens. You're there watching it on the TV.
Yeah.
At what stage did you decide, okay, I smell a rat here? Pretty quickly by the sounds of it. At what stage did you decide to start researching it?
Well, those are 2 different separable issues, it turns out, because, I mean, watching those buildings being destroyed and then later being described as collapses when they manifestly are not collapses. I mean, these 2 buildings are being destroyed from the top down. All the floors are remaining stationary, waiting their turn to be blown to kingdom come. This required an enormous amount of energy. According to the government account, the only sources of energy were the plane impacts and the relatively modest fires, which didn't burn long enough or hot enough to cause the steel to weaken, much less melt. Below the hit points, those were stone cold steel. The steel was tapered 6 inches at the base up to a 1/4 inch at the top. The mass of the upper portions was minuscule compared to the mass of the lower portions. If you take the North Tower as an illustration,
but haven't scientists subsequently said, in refutation of what you've just said, that the fires caused by the intense heat of the burning jet fuel didn't have to be sufficient to melt the steel? They just had to weaken it enough for the floors to start collapsing like dominoes going down, one on top of another.
Yeah, but it's not scientifically sustainable, Howard. I mean, that's why I put together this research group, to bring experts together, just as I had done in the case of JFK, to demonstrate that this is flim-flam, that this is, you're being bamboozled, you're being conned. I mean, this will work for the gullible and the weak-minded, but once you begin to study the evidence, I mean, I'm laying out those 20 key points in Why Doubt 9/11 on 9/11scholars.org. I think no one who understands those 20 key points could continue to be taken in. Think of it this way, Howard. Suppose the thesis you're advancing, which was a government account, were true. Since those fires were distributed asymmetrically, then if they had weakened the steel, which is preposterous because the steel actually had been certified to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 to 4 hours without suffering any damage, a proposition that was tested, by the way, by a fire in the North Tower in 1975, where there was a fire of that degree of intensity that lasted that duration, and yet they did not have to replace any of the steel. It was at that point, by the way, that they made the decision to install a sprinkler system in the entire, all the buildings. Not only was the fire distributed asymmetrically, but if it had burned hot enough to weaken the steel, which is not possible given the quality of the steel and the modest temperature of the fires, which even NIST confirmed when it studied 236 samples of the steel and found that 233 had not been exposed to temperatures above 500 degrees Fahrenheit, which corresponds to that of an ordinary office fire, and the other three not above 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit.
So, in other words, the towers should not have come down.
The towers should not have come down.
The towers would not have collapsed.
Absolutely. Not only that, but their intricate lattice structure was such that the impact of planes on the towers would have had negligible effects, some local damage. But it wouldn't have had, any catastrophic effects whatsoever. It wouldn't have threatened the integrity of the buildings at all.
Jim, I want to ask you a question that's nothing to do with mechanics or to do with the construction of the building, but I think is crucial to all of this because it's been on my mind a lot since my visits to New York and in the years that I've thought about this. It is undeniable that there were people who were not at the buildings on that day who might ordinarily have been there. The population of the buildings was smaller on the day than perhaps it ought to have been.
Yes.
Have you researched why certain people were not there? And if you have, what have you found out?
Well, let me just mention, there was a wonderful restaurant, I think it was at the top of the South, but it may have been the top of the North Tower, called Windows on the World. Larry Silverstein would go there for breakfast every morning, but on 9/11 he didn't show up. His daughter, who also worked at the World Trade Center, didn't show up. I had a little old Jewish lady call me from Brooklyn to tell me that their rabbi had told them in their synagogue that they should not go into Lower Manhattan that day. And a very...
Have you documented that?
Well, let me, go one step further, which is this, that an internationally celebrated concert pianist, Evie Martin, who travels widely, has pointed out to me, and she's Greek, that articles were published in Greek newspapers that were based on Israeli newspapers, which were reporting that some 3,000 Jewish lives had been saved that day by warnings that they not go into the Twin Towers. I have copies of the newspapers. And
could they just have been leaks from security warnings that were filtering through, but the dots were never joined up properly? And that's one of the failings of 9/11, that the security warnings were not heeded properly and acted upon properly. Could that just be part of that process?
That's the official rubbish line that we're being sold. In fact, Richard Clarke at the end of the BBC documentary you just watched is trying to resuscitate the theory that it was incompetence in communication between the CIA, the FBI, and so forth that allowed.
But we know that in history, if you look at British history, for one, our history and yours too is full of what they call the cock-up theory of history here. The theory that stuff happens because it's messed up, not because somebody planned it.
Well, this is where the cover-up is so revealing. I mean, the official stories we've been given are not only false, they're provably false, and they even violate laws of physics, laws of engineering, and laws of aerodynamics. I mean, that's one of the points I make in that summary document, Why Doubt 9/11. Now, remember, Howard, my PhD is in the history of science and the philosophy of science. I have now published 29 books and hundreds of articles. I founded an international journal, Minds and Machines, which I edited for 10 years, an international society for machines and mentality, and an international library called Studies in Cognitive Systems. I mean, listen, if I'm going to get involved in a research project, I'm going to do it right. I know the limits of my own background and capabilities, which is why I bring in experts on other areas, such as a world authority on the human brain, and an expert on wound ballistics, and an expert on X-rays and all that. In the case of JFK, here I brought in physicists and engineers and pilots. I mean, I don't make up any of this. It is